Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror and detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Lechuza horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story.
Lechuza.
This is my first time posting on Reddit. I have many paranormal stories, but I decided to go with my craziest one yet, just to see if anyone else has ever experienced something similar. This happened about 7 years ago, when I was 16. One night I was home with my mom, older cousin, Lonnie, and my friend, Victor. My mom and cousin had been drinking some, but my friend and I, being only 16, hadn't imbibed. My mom and Lonnie decide they want to go do something, but it's about midnight and in our little town nothing is open at this point. So we decide to just go for a ride, my friend driving, me in the passenger seat and my mom and cousin in the back. After a little bit of driving, they tell us they need to go to the restroom, so we head to the nearest facilities, at the softball field which is behind our high school football field. After seeing that the bathrooms are poorly lit, they get too scared and decide they can hold it. So we start driving towards the brightly lit football field, Mom and Lonnie chattering in the back, when Victor and I see a person sprinting unbelievably fast on the football field track. Mom and Lonnie are oblivious, but we are intrigued. Who could be out here past midnight on the track that is fenced in and locked? Is it someone running from the cops? He drives closer and turns on his brights to get a better look at this tall, slender person, dressed in white head to toe, making a mad dash down the track. Suddenly, the person took flight. Its shape seamlessly shifted into what we describe as when someone puts a sheet over their bodies and spreads their arms. Its wingspan was huge. It was still a brilliant white, and it swooped up towards the bright lights of the football field and over the fence. That was about when Victor slammed on the gas and we sped the hell out of there. The whole thing took less than 5 minutes as my mom and cousin saw nothing of it, but Victor and I know what we saw. The first thing that came to our minds was the Mexican legend of Lechuza, a shape-shifting witch that is said to be able to change into a large white bird or owl. Does anyone here have any similar experiences or ideas of what we saw that night? Second story. I saw Lechuza, and I want to go back. Okay, I know. I am sure this story will sound crazy. This all happened about 6 months ago, and I just put it in the back of my head. I wasn't planning on writing a story or really talking about it more, but some recent events have made this all come flooding back. I am jumping ahead of myself. Let me give you some background. About 6 months ago, my boss asked me to drive to McAllen to go and deliver some paperwork for a company we were trying to win. I work in the IT field, and we deal a lot with something called E-rate. Basically, the government gives a certain budget to schools for technical stuff, and we can bid on those items to win the school. Our bid was late, so there was no way I could get it in the mail and it get to the school on time. They are super picky with these things and won't accept any paperwork after a certain time. I have seen people arrive 3 minutes late and they were still turned away. It's like the Hunger Games, but with IT people, lol. Anyway, we weren't fully done with the bid. So my boss decided to go with me so he could finish filling out the paperwork while we drove to McAllen from San Antonio, Texas. If anyone has driven to McAllen before, you will know what I am talking about. It is the most boring drive that I have ever done, especially early in the morning with a person that doesn't talk to you because they are working. We arrive at McAllen, and we had to stop and get our bid professionally printed and fancy. We were going to be late, so I had to drive like a bat out of hell to get this freaking school. I don't know what I was expecting when we got there. A fanfare? Trumpets blasting from the heavens? Even a warm welcome? Good thing I got none of those. I hustled inside, and the lady at the front desk greeted me and wanted to chat. She kept saying how they wouldn't accept anything late. Wow, I drove from San Antonio? Blah, 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 blah. Lady, let me in. I have 3 minutes. I danced from foot to foot like I had to go to the bathroom, and she finally gave me my visitor badge so I could barrel through the hallway in a desperate attempt to get this stupid packet turned in. I am sure you have all done this before. The run through the hallway. Walk past the doors, hustle in school? That was me. However, brand new heels on freshly polished tile made me look like a drunk mad woman barreling through a school. I finally got to where I needed to go and burst into the door. A man was sitting contentedly at his desk. He looked at me, looked at the packet, and without a word took it. He checked the time and wrote on packet the exact time, 2:58 p.m. I puffed out a sigh and tried to make a joke about how I am glad I made it in time. Yada yada yada. He gave me a sideways glance and put the packet down. He returned to whatever he was doing at his desk while I stood awkwardly in front of him. So, is that it? I asked, still half expecting some grand congrats or even a word to come out of this man. He simply nodded and I trudged my way back through the halls, a bit disappointed that I went through so much effort for such a shitty ending. The car was still running outside and my boss sat anxiously in the passenger seat. I sat back in the driver's seat, a bummed expression plastered over my face. Did you get it in? He asked, shifting a bit. I sadly shook my head and he froze in horror. I am not good at lying, so I burst into laughter, and he let out a sigh of relief and a joking, I hate you. From there, we went to eat something and I saw Barnes & Noble. Of course, I had to go. We didn't drive almost 4 hours to be here for an hour then leave. I tinkered around in Barnes & Noble's and found the New Age section. I have seen spirits and ghosts since I was a child, so this section was my go-to. I love to learn about metaphysical, paranormal, mystical, whatever you want to call it, I will devour it. A few books and a Barnes & Noble membership later, and we were back in the car. The sun was beginning to set, so we figured we needed to get home. I don't remember the exact time, but it was probably around 4:30 p.m. If we were lucky, we could be back home around 8 p.m. Since I drove up, my boss agreed to drive. The drive back was just as boring, if not more so, because it was dark. The long road seemed to go on and on. We joked a bit when we arrive at border control. My boss is Hispanic and I am white, so we made a few jokes that he wouldn't be able to cross over. Despite it being so late, there were tons of people waiting at border control. We literally waited an hour, and by the time we got through, it was already 6 p.m. We continued to drive, and I began to notice that there wasn't a single car around us. How was it that border control had an hour line with all the people, yet no one was around us at all? I tried to entertain my boss by talk of adventures and stories. We had a pretty good chat until he started asking about my book selections. The conversation of spirits and creatures arose, and, as if it was planned, we saw it. About a mile up the road, these roads are flat as flat can be. You can see a pretty good distance. We could see a white-ick object. You could tell it was big because it was really far off and we could see it. Plus, my boss doesn't have very good vision and he could see it from where we were. We both stopped talking and stared at this white thing, in a bit of confusion. It is hard to describe how it felt to look at this thing, but my boss described it the best. It felt as if you couldn't look away, as if you were meant to stare at it forever and you could never look away. I agree with this, but I also felt like I didn't want to look away, as if all light was getting sucked into this white object, and it seemed to emit this light as a comforting, guiding light. Despite my love of all things paranormal, I tried to rationalize this. I tried to think of what it could be, but it was as if a mist had settled in my brain and I couldn't really think clearly. I wanted to go to the light. It was there. Right there. Just get closer. My boss and I entered this weird hypnotic state, and luckily the roads were so freaking straight that we wouldn't have gone off the road unless my boss yanked the wheel. The figure grew closer, and we started to realize how big it was. We were driving a car that was a pretty standard size. I don't remember the type of car, but I will compare it to a Camry. This white object was about 3 or 4 feet taller than the car we were in. I stand about 5 feet 8 inches without heels, and this thing was probably, I don't know, 6 foot something? As we got closer, it was as if we could finally rationalize what we were seeing. I know when people see things they are excited or shocked by, they exaggerate and say, "Oh man, it was this big," and this makes some ridiculous arm width to show the size of it. I am not exaggerating when I say this thing was a giant white owl. Not like the owl from Harry Potter and not like a barn owl. It was just a big white owl. It was as if the darkness was being sucked into every feather. Our mouths dropped and I gave a small gasp of wonder. I have been to a few bird conservatories, and there was no way this was a real owl. I would have thought I was imagining it, but my boss, who is a very clear thinker, saw it as well. "Lechuza," he muttered, and suddenly the car began to accelerate violently. "What are you doing?" I gasped, wanting to go see the owl. Every inch of me wanted to just get out of the car and go see this beautiful owl.
No.
"Lechuza," he said back. We were now speeding towards this owl, and suddenly it opened its wings wide. Its wingspan was bigger than the car. Easy. It didn't fly away, however. It just stood there with its wings open, sucking every bit of darkness in from around it, as if it were a black hole of white light. We zoomed past it, and I looked back to see the owl, but it was gone. My boss had wild eyes as he drove. Eventually, he slowed down, and we didn't speak a word the rest of the drive. So, why am I bringing this up now? I moved into a house back in April. I had a few ghost run-ins, but we have been living in peace with it, so I am not too worried. I have a 200-year-old oak that sits in my front yard. Last night, I heard an owl right outside my window. It sounded like it was sitting on my windowsill, but I couldn't see it from the window. I had put this whole ordeal in the back of my head, but as I stood below this giant tree in my pajamas in the middle of the night, shining a flashlight into the branches to catch a glimpse of this owl, I remembered everything. Chills danced on my arms as I decided I should go to bed. This morning, I went into the backyard to take my dogs out, and there, flying above me, was a huge white owl. I am obsessed now. I want to find it. I want to see it. I don't know if it is truly Lechuza or something else, but every cell in my body is screaming for me to find it. I have been researching all morning to find more info. I have found some photos of smaller versions of this owl, but everyone says they are photoshopped. Sometimes I feel people just want to say things are photoshopped because they don't want to face the truth. They don't want to think it is possible for this to be real. I have attached some of my research below. Depending on if this owl comes back or not, I think I am going to go find it. I must know what it wants. No, I need to know what it wants. Third story. Don't whistle when it's dark out. While growing up, my family wasn't fortunate. To put it bluntly, we were quite poor. Because of that, entertaining myself as a kid was frequently a very tedious job, and I had to get creative with it. Most of the time I spent outside, where we had a great big yard and the nearest neighbors were 2 miles down the main road. On cold days, my mother would make me stay inside, and I had to resort to the only thing in the house that could entertain a 9-year-old, the family radio. I absolutely loved listening to music on that thing, and I often caught myself whistling along to my favorite tunes while staring out the kitchen window. On one of these occasions, while I was whistling an old Elvis classic, staring out to the cold October afternoon, I remember my mother coming into the kitchen and looking at me with annoyance while she was preparing to go into town. "You know, it's gonna be dark soon, so you better stop your whistling," said my mom while turning down the radio's volume. What do you mean? I remember being confused about that since I've never heard my mother say that before. You really shouldn't whistle when it's dark out, continued my mother. It's how you call the dead? The dead? I asked, confused. Yes, demons, ghosts, zombies, and ghouls. All that is dead will rise and come for you if they hear someone whistling at night. I thought about it for a second, then turned up the volume again. Of course she was making that up. Even I was old enough to know that ghosts aren't real. That was what my dad told me when I was scared of my closet, anyway. And besides, she was just saying that to hush me down. I heard my mom making a comment on the loud music, then saying she'll go into town to buy some sugar for tomorrow's coffee. I heard the door close and looked at the clock. 6:35 in the afternoon. One more hour till my dad comes home. I had the house to myself. The gray sky was beginning to turn into a dark void as the night fell over the horizon. I was still staring out the kitchen window and listening to music when one of my favorite songs came on. I don't remember which song exactly it was, but boy, I was crazy over it. Losing myself in the tune, I began to whistle along while dancing across the kitchen, treating it like a dance floor. My mother's advice popped up in my head for a second, but quickly disappeared as the chorus started. When the song ended, I sat down on a chair, breathing heavily in exhaustion from my sick dance moves. As I was filling myself a glass of water from the tap, I quickly glanced out the window, which was now almost completely dark, as only the cloudy sky provided some illumination to the house backyard, which went all the way to the forest. I noticed something in the distance, just barely visible at the start of the forest trees. Looking closely, I managed to see that it was actually two shapes, standing next to each other, about 50 meters from the house. They were both human-looking, although it was hard to tell, as they were almost blended with the dark forest background. I decided that maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, and since I needed to pee, I stopped the radio and went upstairs to the bathroom. When I returned to the kitchen, I looked out the window again, and that's when the adrenaline hit me in the stomach as I began to back away from the glass. One of the shapes was gone, and the other had moved much closer than when I saw it originally. From the 2 seconds I spent looking at the shape, I had noticed that it was definitely human, or at least humanesque. It was bald, and its eyes were closed, and yet I felt as it was staring right at me. I panicked and quickly ran upstairs. As I was running, I heard it tapping on the kitchen window. I went into my room and hid under the covers, trying to make sense of what I saw. I could still barely hear the tapping on the glass from downstairs, and it wasn't stopping. On the contrary, it was getting louder. I had never experienced such fear in my life, and I noticed that I had started crying, but was concentrated on fear and didn't notice until right then. I must have stayed under the covers for 20 minutes, when finally the tapping stopped. I heard an engine outside and immediately sighed with relief. It was my dad, coming back from work. I told him about what I saw, and he grabbed his gun and a flashlight to investigate. He found some footsteps at the edge of the forest, but nothing close to the house. Since then, I refused to be left alone during nighttime and absolutely never whistled again. And ever since that day, I constantly feel that someone is watching me at night, silently, just waiting for me to make the same mistake again. Fourth story. My great aunt. I am an 18-year-old Mexican-American male living in Southern California. I'm a first-generation Mexican-American, and my parents come from really close parts of Mexico. My mom is from Durango, and my father is from its neighboring state, Sinaloa. Now, while my family isn't particularly religious, we're pretty deep into regional folk and spiritual beliefs from where we're from, especially Brujeria and Santeria. So, Mexican witch shit for the uninitiated. I myself like to scrutinize beliefs and ideology as I'm a philosophy major and would like to believe that there isn't some sort of sentient force controlling my life or leading me down a preordained path. But the stories that I'm about to tell you sometimes make me question that, or rather make me question that a lot. When I was a boy, I had a lot of imaginary friends. Like a lot. Mostly because of the fact that I grew up in really bad ghettos, and it was rarely deemed safe for me to go outside by my parents. I spent a lot of time watching cartoons, reading, and just drawing. So you can imagine why I would make up friends to play with me when I was particularly lonely. So when I told my family about the old lady in the corner, they didn't think any of it at first. There'd be times when I'd be playing by myself in the living room or in my parents' room as a kid, and I'd see this fucking old hag in the corner of the room, or I'd just get the feeling that someone was watching me. I'd watch like Courage the Cowardly Dog or Kids Next Door, and then I'd turn around and she'd just be there. She looked ancient. Her hair was this weird mix between wiry and nappy, and on the verge of falling out at the same time. She had these bug eyes that were sunken in, so it looked like she had no eyelids or tissue around her eyes. Like her eyes were suspended in her sockets. Her clothes were tattered and gray, and she had really bony hands. Sometimes she was sitting, and sometimes she was floating, standing. She looked unrealistically tall when she was upright, and her garb covered her body so that I couldn't tell whether there were any feet underneath her. It was weird thinking back on it, though it's really hard to remember everything as I was like 6 or 7 at the time. I know that I was terrified though. I know she wanted to get me. Her expression was horrible and malign. She always carried this look of utter hatred and contempt for me. I'd run screaming and thrashing out of my parents' room while babbling on about how the witch was out to get me, how she was going to kill me. My parents didn't believe me, though I'd find out later it was more out of fear than true disbelief. So I just kept my experiences to myself after a while. She stopped coming around for a while, and I had almost forgotten all about her. But then when I was 10 and had just started puberty, she appeared again. Right after I had started having sleep paralysis. She was there in my night terrors, looking across the room at me from the corner again like when I was a child. In one fit of paralysis, she actually got up and came next to my bed. She didn't sit next to me or press down on me. There were other entities that came and did shit like that to me. But I think I'll talk about those other experiences in my next few posts. Anyways, the sleep paralysis got really bad around 13 and 14. The old woman along with some other things were bothering me to the point that I would get up in hysterics in the middle of the night, grab a steak knife out of the kitchen and start waving it around to try and scare off whatever was tormenting me. My parents thought I was crazy, rightly so. My dad wanted to check me into a ward, and my mom wanted me to start going back to church. I fell into some business with the gang that ran my block and started fucking around with drugs. I was given PCP once without knowing it. That night I came home and tried to kill my dad. It was all sorts of fucked up. This, of course, made my visitations at night or my hallucinations even worse. I'm hesitant even now to fully confirm what happened to me is real because there's so many people out there who claim to see ghosts or demons or the paranormal. And again, being an academic, I'd like to go against the notion that I've been haunted by the spirit of an old hag during my adolescence, or some sorts of demons. But that's really what it appeared to be. I was 15 when I had the last, and the worst experience I can recall having with the woman. At this point, I had given up hard drugs and was on the track team at my high school. I had denounced what little gang ties I had at the time too. Things were beginning to turn around in my life, at least slightly. One night I came home from school particularly beat and just wanted to fall asleep so bad. I drifted off on my couch and just passed out. It was about 4 or 5 and I was home alone. I had had an exceptionally grueling day of sprinting practice, and I was so ready to just go to sleep. But I made the fatal mistake of catching myself as I fell into REM sleep. I was so vulnerable and tired. She waltzed right in from the hallway. I fell into the worst fit of sleep paralysis I'd ever experienced. She was fucking smiling. For the first time since I'd seen her, she was fucking smiling the biggest smile you can imagine. She scuttled over to me with her arms stretched out. She stood over me for a good 10 minutes before I could muster up the strength to shake myself out of it. I spent the rest of the day crying. Her skin was this blotched up and colorless mass that just hung off her face and arms like wet newspaper. Her eyes had become much more crazed than before, and she had a couple of sharpened, gnarled teeth jutting out of her gums. I really thought I was going to die in that moment. I think about that afternoon and all the other times she came and terrorized me at least once or twice a month when I'm all alone with my thoughts. I couldn't wrap my head around why this was happening to me, and I'm always left thinking, why? My mom finally gave me answers maybe a year ago. It turns out my family's pretty deep in all that Mexican witch shit. At least on my dad's side anyway. My mother told me the story like this. When my dad was born in Mexico, he had an aunt that had become obsessed with him. She would pry and badger my grandmother to let her look after my dad, and after a while started to harass her, demanding that my grandma give my dad over to her. She was some sort of witch, according to my grandma, and by extension, according to my mom. She practiced rituals and hexes and had apparently seen great fortune in my dad. When my grandma refused, though, she cursed my dad and whatever family would come after him to suffer and to never know joy or some shit like that. Naturally, my grandma took my dad, and then the move to American. My great-aunt stayed in Mexico and never followed my dad. At least not physically. My mom said that growing up, my parents lived in the same neighborhood growing up, and he told her all about his childhood experiences. My dad saw a lot of entities and suffered from sleep paralysis constantly. He still does to this day. And yeah, he never could hold a job, and my family experienced a lot of financial ruin growing up. Hence why we were always living in the ghetto, or in worse cases, were homeless. My grandma told my mom a story of when some of my great-aunt's kids came to visit her when my father was in his 20s. My dad wasn't at my grandma's place, and they were asking for him. My grandma had some nativity figurines in her dining room, and there was an ashtray in the dining room as well. She was with my great-aunt's kids the entire time they were in the dining room. Between the time she told them my dad wasn't there at the house and wasn't coming over and the time they left, someone had taken the nativity figurines and put them face down into the ashtray. None of them could have done it. My grandma was watching them the entire time they were there. So my mom and grandma had confirmed between themselves that no, my great-aunt hadn't given up on trying to get my dad. Yes, she really was capable of some fucked up shit. I came to my mom around a year ago, and we talked all about the old hag that I used to see, especially about the last time that I saw her when I was 15. My mom had told me that my great-aunt had died around that time, or was on her way out. She told me that what I had seen as a kid and as a teenager were most definitely linked to all of that business, and that she was sorry for trying to make me feel like it wasn't real growing up. She just wanted me to live some sort of normal life and to rise above it, rather than be consumed by it. Some corny line like that. My mom believes that the old hag that I saw was actually my great-aunt, what she really looked like on the inside, all tattered and grotesque. I'm not really sure about that, but I know I'm happy she's gone now. I know that don't ever want to see that old hag ever again. Unfortunately, though, she wasn't the only thing I saw growing up. That afternoon when I was 15 doesn't even come close to the worst experience I've had with the preternatural. Again, I don't claim to know whether any of my experiences were wholly real and to be taken seriously, or whether they were the delusions of an overactive young mind. I'll let you form your own conclusions. But there is a lot more I'd like to tell you all on this platform, and I hope you'll hear me out. My next entry will be about why I'm still afraid of the dark as a young adult, a house I used to visit as a boy that I'm not really sure existed, and a truck that drives next to my house at 2 a.m. every week. Fifth story. Witches don't use brooms anymore. I have seen the eyes of the devil. If you wish to see them for yourself, all you need to do is walk through Highway 57 on the outskirts of Monclova, a northern town of Mexico. I'd like to give you a word of caution, if I may, before you recklessly head on a trip to this old, colonial city. I hope that by sharing my story you'll be able to grasp that there's some pretty fucked up people out there. Some of them might end up haunting you forever. My father was out of the picture before I was even born. As a result, my mother raised me all by herself. It's a bit harsh for me to say this, but I understood to some extent why my father had left. You could serve my mother a rod of steel on a plate, but if she was convinced that it was in fact a piece of cheese, she would have broken her teeth wolfing it down before admitting that she was wrong. She accused me of having sex, of smoking, of doing drugs, you name it. Despite our endless arguing, she just wouldn't believe me. Even as her hands tensed into claws, as her nostrils flared like a wild bull, and her face contorted into an unrecognizable mess, she never laid a finger on me. She didn't need to. The scars left by her venomous tongue could not be healed by time or medicine. I escaped my house a few weeks after my 15th birthday. My mother never paid any attention to my friends, so I was completely out of her radar. Maya and her family welcomed me into their home. I quickly adapted to my new environment. I helped with the chores as much as I could, trying to avoid being a parasite. They assured me several times that I wasn't, but every once in a while I felt like an intruder, an alien meddling into a world that wasn't my own. It was a stormy Friday night when Maya bursted into my room crying her eyes out. She slammed the door behind her and sulked in one of the corners of the door frame. "What happened?" I exclaimed. My mother." "Your mother?" "My mother is not my mother." "What?" "Benny told me that my real mother left me here. She said she'd be back, but... Tears kept flowing down her cheeks as she tried to speak. Her brother had eavesdropped Maya's parents during an argument. After a quarrel over a brownie, Benny, perhaps out of frustration that Maya had once again bested him, delivered the news to her adoptive sister in the only way a 12-year-old can, blunt as a sledgehammer. Maya was inconsolable. "I feel like the whole world has deceived me," she kept saying. She then locked herself in her bedroom. Blink 182's Apple Shampoo blasted through the speakers of her stereo. How appropriate. A few days after that cat got out of its bag, Maya decided that she couldn't live in a house built on lies anymore. "Let's go live somewhere by ourselves," she said. "But where?" I argued. "I'll ask my sisters." Maya's sisters were all married women. Only Benny and herself had not flown out of the nest. One of them offered us a house on the outskirts of Monclova. She even got me a full-time job despite my age. The house was a tad claustrophobic, but adequate for a couple of teenagers running away from their demons. What our house lacked on the inside was compensated with breathtaking scenery. Green and lush landscapes meshed together along the jagged peaks of Sierra de la Gloria, Monclova's mountain range. Who would have thought those stuck-up country folk had it right all along? For the first couple of days, peace reigned on the woodlands. We started decorating our new home. Maya and I got along great, and even the neighbors were extremely nice to us. It was good. Too good. Maya was stuck with a crappy shift. She would arrive home at about 9 or 10, mainly because the only bus that could pick her up at that hour went through an unnecessary loop through the northern end of Monclova. One evening I was fancying a hot dog from the 7-Eleven down the road. That down the road was a pilgrimage of about 20 blocks through a forest side trail to the nearest gas station. It had some illumination, but I wouldn't recommend crossing it on your own at night. Maya dragged herself into the house, her eyes and eyebrows drooping as she collapsed on one of the armchairs. "Tough day, huh?" I said. "Yup. Want a hot dog? I have a craving for some 7-Eleven Vikings." "Yeah, I could use some fresh air," she said. It was 11:30 p.m. when we stepped out of the house. We walked for about 15 minutes before noticing a car slowing down behind us as it passed through the highway. The first thing that came into my mind, oddly enough, was that some jerk was prepping up some catcalling. A green Volkswagen cab slowed down to our pace. We kept walking, trying to keep ourselves focused on the road in front of us. "Where are you heading?" "Need a ride?" the cab driver asked. We ignored the man, as if he didn't exist. "Hey, where are you going?" "Need a ride?" the man spoke once more. We picked up the pace again. "The lady wants to know where you're going," the man said with a graver, darker tone. "No thank you. We're just heading to the 7-Eleven," I said coolly. Our stroll became almost a jog at this point. "I'm going that way. Why don't you step into the car?" "We'll take you there," a woman said. We both stopped dead in our tracks. There was definitely something off with her voice, something that made my skin crawl. I turned around ready to put an end to their harassment. Her eyes caught me off guard. They were big, orange, searing suns. Her copper, wrinkled skin looked like she'd been sunburnt for decades. A tuft of black hair rested in mangles across her scalp. "Where are you going?" she asked. We're going to the 7-Eleven. "Why don't you step inside the car then?" "I'm going that way." "We'll drop you off there." "No thanks, we're almost there," I blurted. The old woman craned her neck and tilted her face like a string puppet. For some reason I could not stop looking at her. She chuckled. "Why would you stay here? Can't you see that not even your mothers love you? Come with me," she said. "Your mother never loved you, and yours never believed you."
Come?
How the hell did she know? As I snapped out of her gaze, I held in a scream. Maya was already grabbing the handle of the passenger door. She was crying again, just like on that stormy Friday night. I grabbed her and tried to pull her away from the car, but she wouldn't budge. "It's true. It's all true," she whispered. Somehow I was able to pry my friend away from the car. As I held her in my arms, Maya blabbered something I couldn't really understand. The old woman cackled, most likely convinced that she had finally broken us for good. "Get in," she bellowed. My mother shoved the Bible way too many times down my throat in a poor attempt to convince me that God was real. It's funny how as we laid there, completely helpless, I wished with all of my heart for him to save us. I screamed as hard as my lungs allowed me to, "In the name of God, leave us alone." For the briefest moment, the world stopped turning for Maya and me. When I opened my eyes, the lady and her cab were gone. They'd been replaced by the faint whistle of a cool summer breeze and the buzz of the luminary poles. Since the walk back home was longer than what was left to reach the 7-Eleven, we suffered through the rest of the trail to the gas station. We must have given the clerk a heart attack when he saw us storm inside screaming, weeping, and gasping for air. We stayed in the store until dawn. We dared not even look outside, fearing that the cab would be there, waiting for us. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes the woman was there, glaring at me with those hellish eyes. I found out that there's some history behind this woman. Maria Josefa de Urugis was secretly imprisoned and trialed on July of 1759 by prominent members of the church. She would be charged and found guilty of selling her soul to the devil, fornication with demons, witchcraft, and spell casting. Maria was proud of every single one of these acts. Lucifer was her master, and she was his whore. Her inquisitors sentenced her to burn at the stake. But according to folklore, she vanished from her cell the night before her execution. Her physical description matches almost perfectly to the woman we saw that night. After talking to the locals and the military troops that patrol Highway 57, we found out we're not the first ones to encounter the Witch of Monclova. I try not to think about what would have happened if we had stepped inside that cab, but every now and then, I can still see her eyes when I close mine. A gaze that will follow me for the rest of my days. A gaze of pure evil. Sixth story. Cryptid encounter my mom had around 2000. I'm resubmitting this as my other post was eliminated because of the editing, and I tried to fix it and resubmit it, but it would keep saying eliminated. Well, this is my first post. I hope it's to your liking. If you want to skip the background of my family and the town, go to the line below, and there's where the story starts. This happened to my mom and stepfather. They say it's true, although I never saw it and I can't vouch for their honesty in this story, so take it with a grain of salt. First, a little background on my family, at least my mom's side. She was born to a wealthy family from Mexico State, not Mexico City, but state. My grandpa was a son of a Chinese and my grandma a big mix of blood, German descendant father, French Spaniard mother. My grandma is open-minded and self-called witch, and my mom had a lot of paranormal situations that I might post later, if you wish me to do so. Bottom line, my grandma was really perceptive of anything paranormal, and my mom inherited that, and was some sort of passive ghost whisperer, meaning she could see spirits everywhere, but she didn't bother them nor try to help them, and they didn't pester her. So, background of her abilities explained, let's go into this occurrence. We, at the time, lived in a small town in the Mexican countryside in the land of the tequila, Jalisco. The name of the town is La Quemada, in case you were wondering, and for those that like to investigate deeply, this is where we lived at the time. 20.9699626 minus 104.048184. First of, the town is a really small town, founded by family of my stepfather, and everyone knows each other. Literally, half of the town was family at that time, 2000s. I actually celebrated the change of century in that precise house, so it was about that time. Now, in these small Mexican countryside towns, the life is quite peculiar, and the everyday life is a mix between monotony, religiousness, and superstition. There were tons of legends in this particular town. Just south from my house, at the left side of the church, there was an abandoned small fortress or little castle. The thing is that it was from the time of the conquest, and there were ghosts inside the ruins. There was a legend of a weird, large snake living in the little river also south from my house. That river might actually be dry now. I haven't been there for ages. And one of the most widespread beefs was that of the Nahuales. There is no actual translation for the word. They were witches/sorcerers. They had a lot of power and wisdom if they were good ones. And they could transform into animals, usually dogs, wolves, or birds. Now, with that background of the town itself, let's go to the story. It was night. In this old-school countryside towns, they were used to have the bathrooms outside of the house, and my mom wanted to go to the bathroom. As the bathroom was in the courtyard, and the wall facing the street was being reconstructed, the old wall was made of mud brick and was falling apart. She didn't want to go out to the bathroom by herself, so she woke my stepdad. It was about 2 a.m. They dressed up and went to the bathroom, and when my mom was done and came out, my SD was looking up. He had always been the kind of guy who would sometimes enjoy to look at the stars, especially in such a town, far away from any light contamination. The stars were awesome to look at there. But in this occasion he was not looking into the stars, but into the adjoining home, and she saw what he was looking at. A big winged creature, the wingspan, always according to my mom, was about 3 to 4 meters. Sorry, I'm not used to Imperial system. It had a mid-range gray color, not too dark, not too light. It had no feathers, and the skin was like the skin of a seal or a dolphin. It had two small, almost invisible to the eye, legs tightly on its belly, and they could see no head on this creature. The tail was a triangle. I could honestly not understand if it was like a 3D triangle shape or like a flat triangle, like most birds. But Aegon, no feathers, and they said that there was some sort of fluorescent light emanating from it, like one of those camping light sticks, and that it slightly covered its whole body. Now, they did not feel fear, but wonder, but there was something wrong. My SD thought of going into the house to get the archaic instant camera we had at the time. But when he tried to move, he found he couldn't. My mom, being a bellicose woman, and also very curious, thought of grabbing the broom and try to take it down to capture it and examine it. But she could also not move. That's where the fear, or I should say dread, came. But they couldn't even speak. Other ID points they gave were that the creature made no sound whatsoever, and that it did not move its wings. It was just gliding, and it was extremely slow. It took about 5 to 7 minutes to cover the distance from the adjoining home to the end of the yard. And they could still see it. The street went downwards for about 10 more minutes, time in which they could not move nor speak. They could only follow the creature's trajectory with their head. That's it. Now, if you read the background of the town, you will understand. Most people took this sighting very seriously, and they said my family should protect themselves, because it was a narwhal that was after us. What was it? I don't know, and doubt I'll ever know. Nowadays, with our current tech, I could go for a military-style drone, but even if it had happened nowadays, not 16 years ago, this is a very unimportant town, in the middle of the nowhere, with unimportant people and a lame municipality, Magdalena. And the closest important town is hours away, 4 to 5 hours, Tequila, Jalisco, and is also a not that important kind of town. So even now, what kind of interest would anyone with the capability to have a drone like that would have on such a random small town? If it was true, then IDK what the heck my parents saw, but I would have loved to see it. Just as a PS. I love paranormal stuff. Almost nothing inspires fear in my soul. And yet, I have never been direct witness of any kind of paranormal activity myself, although firmly believe in that stuff. The only thing was a really small UFO sighting that is so small and direct that I will put it here as well. We were going in a Jeep from Manzanillo, Colima, Mexico, to PV, Jalisco, and I was laying on the back of the Jeep, staring at the stars, begging to see something. I always do, LOL, and at that time my prayers must have caused the pity of some UFOs because I saw them, finally. And I know they were no regular craft. They were just like stars, but not so. One was on the right. It made a straight line from right to left, crossing one that came on a diagonal from L to R, and a third one was on the middle. I didn't even look at it until it did what it did. The one in the middle just moved up, north for my POV, and then, like a shooting star, left. The one that came from the right just shot an AZ path and disappeared to the left, and then the one on diagonal straightened up and moved very fast towards the point the first one I saw came from, in the right. And that is it, sad face. Both the main story and my only UFO sighting are true, to my word and the word of my mom. And you may or may not believe it as you wish. I just decided to post the main story to share it and to see if anything similar has happened to any of you. 7th story. I'm looking for an expert in Mexican folklore. I am writing this looking for folklore help, in particular anyone who knows anything about Mexican legends. Google does not seem to cut it, as I just get a few Wikipedia and blog links that are extremely shallow and are not applicable to my situation. In particular, I'm looking for information about La Pelona. My mother and grandparents are Mexican, and I had heard a lot of stories, even though I grew up in America, about La Llorona and El Nahual, and even that chupacabras thing, although I think it started in Puerto Rico. But I had never heard about La Pelona. What I do know is that whatever she is real. It all started a few years ago when I got a chance to travel along the south of Mexico and spend a week with relatives in their rancho. During the day, I would take an hour-long bus, ride to one of the many nearby historic towns, and eat and drink and walk around like a tourist taking photos. Usually by sundown, I would be full and drunk, so I could sleep on the bus ride back to the ranch. After a few days of this, I was feeling worn out and decided to actually explore the small town I was staying in. Downtown was just a couple of blocks around a big church and a plaza, but in every direction, if you walked a little, you made it into the monte, surrounded by brush, crooked trees, and a few barrel cactus. By noon, I was feeling dehydrated, so I started looking for a garden, hose to drink from, or a corner store where I could buy a bottle of water. I saw a bunch of kids who were laughing and playing around a tree, so I asked them where I could get something to drink. One of them offered me a sip from a big plastic cup, but I politely declined. "And ale," she insisted, so I took a big greedy gulp, and it was an agua fresca with pineapple chunks, although I swear it tasted alcoholic, like Tepach. I asked her where she got it, but she pretty much interrupted my last syllable by asking in Spanish, "Do you want to play with La Pelona?" I saw she had a naked Barbie doll in her hand, and it was worn and warped, with its hair completely burnt off. Pelona basically is female and bald, so I chuckled a little, wondering why the child had done this to her doll. "No thank you," I said, and offered the kids a few pesos. "And ale," the child said as the other kids giggled. "My doll just wants to sit in the tree. That's where La Pelona lives." I figured it was harmless fun, so I gently took the doll from her and moved a branch aside with my arm, so I could sit her on a horizontal branch that swooped low like a hammock. As soon as I moved the leaves, I realized I was face to face with something small, pale, and wrinkled, like one of those hairless cats. The kids started to laugh and rushed towards me, so I looked down at them for a second. Then I looked back up and got a good look at La Pelona, who was some sort of balding old woman, barely a foot tall, with sagging breasts and long cat-like claws. She was naked, covered in wrinkles and blood-red dots like chicken pox. Whatever little hair she had on her head fell in little wisps of white, one of them covering part of her cat-like eyes. "Pendejo!" She cackled at me, calling me an idiot. The kids held me as La Pelona jumped from the branch and dug her claws into my scalp, making a hissing, growling noise. I wrestled with the creature that clawed at my scalp, keeping it away from my eyes, while the children laughed and punched me in the stomach and groin, screaming, "Pendejo! Idiota!" and other words for stupid. I was able to tear the thing off me and throw it against the tree, where it landed effortlessly and scampered up. I'm ashamed to admit I punched one of the children in the face and broke free. I kept running, stumbling, and trying not to throw up from the exertion and fear. When I finally made it to my relative's place, I realized I was still holding the burnt and bald Barbie doll. So I threw it over the fence and vomited hard until I had tears in my bloodshot eyes. I told my relatives what happened as they disinfected the scratches on my scalp and rubbed a little Vicks VapoRub on them for God knows what reason other than making them sting. I told them I was attacked by children and some sort of goblin. "No, Pendejo, it was a cat," they corrected me. "Idiota," chuckled my cousins. "You are scared of a cat? How stupid. Leave your window open tonight, so you and the kitty can become friends," one said. In that moment, I realized they had the exact same attitude as the kids, taunting and cruel. So I grabbed my bags and took the next bus out of town. My parents wired me some money and I spent my next 2 nights at a hotel in a tourist town, unable to sleep at night from fear and the itchy pain I felt in the stitches I got at a clinic. Then I caught my flight home. 2 years later, I've decided to finally give in and look for information about what happened to me, with little to no success. I tried to forget, to imagine I was dehydrated and got attacked by a cat, but the memory is way too vivid. I can see her clearly when I close my eyes. Also, I've gotten scratches from a cat before, and they healed right up. Not these. I have to shave my head now since my hair grows in patches, completely avoiding the pale scars La Pelona left behind. Eighth story. You know the legends about skinwalkers, right? This past October, I had worked at a that is, a haunted attraction at a local theme park. I was pretty good at managing the big crowds, but what I really enjoyed was when the crowds would get smaller and groups of 10 to 20 people were coming into my attraction. During times when the crowds were thin like that, I loved scaring them with stories and legends I knew about, and one of my favorite legends to tell them were the Skinwalker legends. I would start off greeting the group and tempting them with the offer to tell them all a story, asking them if they would like to hear a local legend, as we live in the desert, and this haunt was tucked away in the heart of miles of desert land. When they would agree, I would start my tale. Some of you may know about skinwalkers, and for those of you that do, you might know that native Navajo and Hopi tribes are fearful to even speak of this creature, or to even utter its name. These monsters span from southern Arizona, all through to New Mexico and the Mexican border, and across the lands of the native peoples. The Navajo believe them to be witches or shaman, an evil being with the supernatural power to shapeshift, typically by wearing the skins or masks of the animal they wish to walk as, a practice which is looked down upon by the Navajo people. This power is gained after killing a close relative or sibling, and imbues the being with many dark powers. The animal they appear as, however, always looks wrong. A deer or coyote that stands on its hind legs and walks as a man does, a crow or owl, or has a face or eyes that look too human to belong to the animal they mimic, and that glow red in the moonlight. In all the legends, it says there is always one sure way to identify a skinwalker. A skinwalker, no matter what, will never be able to move as the creature it appears as in its animal form. Skinwalkers are able to do other things as well. They can move at seemingly impossible speeds, and can mimic the voice of people, crying babies, your friends, or loved ones, voices you would trust. They will lure you out into the forests or into the pitch black of the nighttime desert, and once they have you isolated, and you lay your eyes upon their face, it is said you will die an agonizing death. Skinwalkers can curse people and cause them great suffering. Often, it is said they use a mixture that some call corpse powder when seen in their human form, which turns your tongue black and causes violent convulsions until you die. The worst part about skinwalkers? The reason native people dare not speak of it? It is believed that a skinwalker is capable of reading your minds, and the more aware of them you are, the more aware they become of you. So try not to think about it. But if on your ride home you see a coyote in your path, or hear the drums of native people echoing loudly through the darkness, take care to drive quickly and pray it will not pursue you. And I would, almost always, be met with looks of horror and fear. It was my absolute favorite tale to tell for this reason. I would tell this story over and over to as many groups as I could. It wasn't a good idea to talk about them. I would say as much with each recounting of the legend, and much less in the middle of the desert, surrounded by inky blackness that engulfed everything the park's lights didn't illuminate, but I did. I felt safe. Nothing would happen to me. It was just a legend. That was, until I drove home after my shift, Around 1 in the morning, after a night of telling this particular story dozens of times to guests. As I drove through the twists and turns of the pitch-black mountainous desert road I traveled each night to go home, my high beams on, penetrating the darkness just enough for me to see the road and the first layer of brush on either side of it, my headlights shone on an animal, a coyote. At first I thought it was just the angle the lights had hit it at that made it appear to have no tail, but as I continued driving, I encountered the animal again, 3 times, each within several miles of each sighting, a distance any normal animal wouldn't have been able to make, especially when running against a car going 65 miles per hour for most of the journey. Each time I would scan the road for wildlife, and I would see it, there, just outside of the darkness, the coyote with no tail, staring at me from the side of the road. My stomach churned a bit, and I breathed deep, trying to tell myself I was just imagining things. The coyotes had tails, and none of them were the same animal. It wasn't possible. I couldn't be. But I knew deep down, I was lying to myself. I knew I was wrong. I knew it was real, and it was terrifying. I'm relieved to say I made it home safely that night, but still, every now and then, when I drive through the desert in the darkness of night, or glance out my bedroom window into the blackness, I can see that coyote, that skinwalker. I hope it never decides I know too much, but I think that maybe, just maybe, it visits me to remind me of its presence, that it wants me to continue telling this story, to continue spreading awareness of their presence, so that it can claim the lives of those who are weak-minded enough to fall prey to it. And now that you know the story, maybe it will come after you. 9th story. I saw a witch in Mexico. I grew up in a small town in Guanajuato, Mexico with my aunts and grandma. My parents were in the U.S. trying to buy a house for me to move into. I was about 5 years old at the time. One calm evening my aunt and I were going to go down to the town square to hang out with her friends. She instructed me to go tell my grandma that we were leaving. She told me that my grandma was in the garden. The backyard was big and the garden was at the very back. I didn't think twice about it. I went to the back of the house and started to walk towards the garden. The sun was setting, but it was bright enough to see everything clearly. While walking, I happened to glance to my right at an old shed that we had. Next to the shed, there was a stack of ceramic roof shingles because the house was going to have the roof refurbished. What I saw next still gives me chills today. As I looked over to the shingles, I saw a woman dressed in all black. The woman's clothes were the darkest black I had ever seen. Next to this woman was an all-black cat with bright yellow eyes looking right at me. I stopped walking and looked at the woman. I tried to look for her face, but was not able to due to a hood that covered it. The only thing I could tell was that she was not sitting on the pile of shingles. She was crouching on it. The shape of her knees could be seen through the clothing. Her pale, bony hands dangled down by her feet. I was frozen in place, but for some reason I was not afraid. After a few seconds of looking at her, I remembered that I had to go to tell my grandma. I continued to walk to the garden while periodically glancing back. I saw my grandma and told her that my aunt and I were going down to the town square. She acknowledged me as I jogged back to my aunt. On the way back, I looked back at the pile of shingles thinking that I would see the lady again. Nothing. Both the woman and the cat were gone. I am 25 years old now, and I still can't explain what that thing was on the pile of shingles. I have told one of my aunts that still lives in that house in Mexico about my experience, and she told me that many people have seen that lady and her cat around the town. Everyone seems to agree that she is some kind of witch or possessed woman. I recently went back to Mexico to visit my family. Every time I walked past that old shed, I felt like someone was watching me. I don't know if I want to go back there ever again. This is not the only story I have of my childhood in Mexico. Let me know if I should share more. 10th story. True events in the house of the Mexican witch. I don't believe in the paranormal, and I have always tried to find the logical things behind everything. Until this day, I don't believe in the paranormal, but there are some events of my life that have made me question my beliefs. At that time of these events, I used to live in Mexico, and my mom, who is huge Catholic and believer of the paranormal, used to go with these old lady who lived in the outskirts of the city that we used to live. I am talking about a 30-minute drive to the rural part. She will get a religious cleansing at Olympia, but she would get the tarot read to her too. Being the oldest brother, I would usually ride with her and stay inside the car, because I do not believe in anything spiritual. Back then we didn't have cell phones, and I got out of the car to pressure her to leave already. I was afraid of my mom driving late in the night in a region that is famous for disappearing persons. When I got inside the small wooden house, shit, I know this sounds like fiction, but these events are all real. The old lady opened her eyes wide and told me that I needed a cleansing. I thought she was just trying to get some more money, but she did not ask money from my mom. I learned that my mom took her some groceries, and that was how she paid her. I refused politely, because I am not religious, and I even believe less in limpias, as they are called in Mexico. Yet she insisted because I had strong negative vibes. I complied to get this over. This was not the first time someone that works with magic has told me this. In her defense, she did tell me things that later became truth, such as my grandma's sickness and other events in my personal life. She did warn my mom that she would meet a person that would claim to be something, but that she was evil. The scary part starts after a year of my only limpia, when my mom decided that it was too far, and that she had met a friend at work that also did this. The woman read the tarot and other weird stuff. She was from Chiapas, a state in Mexico in the south, and we lived in the north of Mexico. Since the beginning I disliked her, because she looked an evil person. I don't know why my mom decided to befriend her. For months, my mom kept on visiting her, but weird stuff happened in her house, such as lights flickering, TV turning off, and my mom would see things and get scared. She had 5 kids, 4 girls, and 1 boy, and I had a great relationship with them. That was the only thing that kept me sane. She also told me the same stuff about how I needed a cleansing. My mom started to like her less and less, because she started to do more black magic. Or that is what my mom told me. I tell you this background because the event that scarred me for life happened in that house. That woman mistreated her sons all the time. And this time they couldn't see TV for stupid and unjust reasons some reason. We were talking, the teenagers, in one room, and my mom and the women were in a separate room. To this day, I can't really understand what I saw. There was a floor lamp in the hallway between the living room, where we were, and the room my mom was at. The lamp was casting a shadow, and I remember that I used to stare at it whenever I was bored, waiting for my mom to exit that hallway. This time it was different, because there was another shadow there. It was like small human, and I am talking extremely small. I tried to convince myself that it was the shadow of something else, but then I saw the shadow move naturally, like it was trying to look for something, or at something, moving its arms and flexing its little creep legs. I do get scared, but I have always had this stupid urge to be brave and the leader. If this was a movie, I would have been the person that goes and checks the sound and dies stupidly. I wanted to prove that thing wasn't moving, and that it didn't exist. Therefore, I decided to ask my friend, Jose Luis, "What is that? On top of lamp? Do you see it?" His physical reaction drained the color out of me. His eyes opened wide and he ignored it. "Don't look at it." My mouth went dry, but I kept on looking. I could believe that the little shit was real. Then my mom screamed, and everyone jumped. The woman told her that it was fine, that it was nothing. My mom politely declined to stay longer, because it was already late. I turned to try to see the small man, but the shadow was not there anymore. I asked my mom what had happened, and she said that she had seen a man's face through the window and only half of the body. She still thinks I have some connection with the paranormal, which I don't, but I used the excuse that I could feel something evil coming from her to convince her to never go back there. I truly did feel that way, that she was evil, and that she could do us harm. I have revised the moment in my mind and gone over the events countless times. I still think I saw something else, and that my mind played tricks on me. I have had other stuff in my life that have no answers, but these is the only time I have backed down, and I did not take a second look.